Welcome to The Forest Garden, your guide to transforming your organic gardening practice into an edible and holistic forest garden landscape. On today's episode, we will be covering all things fall harvesting. It may come as a surprise to you that even in cold, temperate climates, you can implement strategies to harvest all winter long. This concept of the 4-season harvest will be covered in depth today, along with various other fall-related tips and tricks, including our favorite fruit and nut trees to harvest from this time of year, and a few perennial vegetables as well. So stick around and enjoy the show.
Welcome to another episode of the Forest Garden Podcast with Mike Amato and Ben Bishop. This week we're talking about fall. This is probably going to be the last episode where we cover what we like to do in the fall, what we think is important in the forest garden during the fall before we go into the winter season, which is markedly different. There are some similarities. So in this episode, we're going to cover everything from harvesting, which fall's a busy type of year. There's a lot of harvesting going on. And then in late fall activities, which could include pruning, storage of the vegetables, grafting. We'll really get into it on this episode. Fall is one of my favorite times of year, and it's a very busy time, but it's a good time to be in the forest garden.
Yeah, it's an important time of year. Often, most people like myself who were cultivating annual gardens, we don't really think about the fall as a time to be harvesting or to be sowing, which is what we talked about in our previous episode. Our first episode, we talked about all things fall, composting, then we moved on to fall sowing as this idea of broadcasting seed or how to potentially take a more active role in making sure that your plants survive through the winter. In this episode, we're really going to be diving into the stuff that is maybe the more extreme or interesting side of things, which is the fall and winter harvest. And we're also going to be talking about pruning and storage and about some of the more interesting crops that people often overlook. Like, winter squash might not be that interesting to most people, but it is to us because Ben and I are some big old plant nerds.
Yeah, when we get into it, I'll talk about my adventures tracking down one of the most rare winter squashes in the world.
So for me, the first time I ever really was introduced to the idea of a 4-season harvest was when I was in Acadia. When I was there, I stumbled upon this book, Eliot Coleman's The 4-Season Harvest, where he describes not only gardening for the summer, but gardening for the fall, for the winter, for the spring, and how he plans for all of that. It was one of the first introductions I had to all of these plants I'd never heard of, some of them being Herba Stella plantain, also known as Minutina, or watercress. There was a long list of things, whether it be arugula, like perennial arugulas, or annual arugulas. I knew that arugula was a very tasty, delicious plant. I had no idea that it was such a hardy plant, or that it had a perennialized version of itself that was, a cousin of annual arugula, or that you could eat beet greens, or that broccoli rabe was something that could be cultivated in a covered setting with a double cover system. I could go on and on and on, but before we really get into this kind of stuff, or before we really get into Eliot Coleman's 4-Season Harvest, why don't we just kind of introduce the entire episode?
With the harvest moon, which usually arrives towards the end of September, the garden steps over into that sweet, melancholy season where ripe abundance mingles with auguries of the end anyone can read, except perhaps some of the tropical annuals, which seem to bloom only more madly the closer frost comes. Mindless of winter's approach and the protocols of dormancy, the dahlia and marigold, the tomato and basil make no provision for frost, which might be a month away or a day. The annuals in September practice none of the inward turning of the hardy perennials, which you can see slowing down, taking no chances, turning their attention from blossom and leaf to root and stashed starch. But instead of battening down the hatches, saving something for another day, the annuals throw themselves at the thinning sun, open-armed and ingenuous. On those early autumn days, when frost hangs in the air like a sword of Damocles, evident as sunlight to the lowest creature, is there anything much more poignant than a dahlia's blithe, foolhardy bloom? When the mildest frost, one of those tentative breaths of winter September often brings, could blast it black overnight? reading from Second Nature by Michael Pollan.
I've never read that book. I'm a huge fan of him, but
Yeah, I think this is one of his first.
yeah, I was gonna say I've never heard of that one. It's he's an author who I have recommended to so many friends and purchased books. Like I'll do this thing where I'll buy the same book when it comes out for like all of my family members, and then all of them will be like, "Oh, it was so good," and I just they have no idea that I'm just like mass reproducing that Christmas gift or whatever.
Well, he's writing about growing in Connecticut for most of the book, at least.
He's a Massachusetts resident, though, isn't he?
Maybe he is now, but he has a chapter about growing when he lived in Cornwall. And he has a whole, like this, I don't know if it's the start of the book or the first, somewhere in the first chapter, he talks about Dudleytown, which I'm hoping you've heard of before.
Oh yeah, I know all about Dudleytown. Interesting. Maybe he lives in Connecticut and I just never knew, but he like teaches at Harvard and commutes.
Well, that's an old book, so that might be something from from when he was living in Connecticut. He wrote about it.
Michael Pollan, if you're listening to the episode, it's time for you to chime in. No, all right. So very cool, very appropriate reading there.
Yeah, I think about that a lot when I think about the difference between perennial plants and annual plants. I mean, it's obvious now, but that passage helped me understand the behaviors are different when it comes to perennial plants that are, they're sensing that the fall is coming, that the frost is coming, and they change the way they store energy in the plant tissue, and they change their behavior, and they have to, because otherwise if they don't take those precautions, they're not going to come back next year. Just look at the annuals.
It's a very good point. Something that I've been maybe thinking about in terms of what we're going to broach in this episode is the pushing of those boundaries, whether it be perennials or annuals, in sort of a covered system in cold climates. For our listeners, I've said this many times in this podcast, but I'm in zone 6. Ben is also in roughly zone 6. Either of us could maybe be on the border of zone 7, but we're essentially in a cold climate where we have a 4-season climate and potentially a 4-season harvest. One of the things that we can do is we can implement covered systems like a greenhouse or cold frames, or even just as simple as throwing a blanket over some of the cold hardier crops in your garden that are in a somewhat protected area, depending on where you are. So it's kind of interesting to think about perennials and annuals in this fashion. I almost want to say that when it comes to this 4-season harvest and harvesting windows and all those sort of things, that annuals have been the focus in some way. And to me, it almost feels like we can take advantage of that more than perennials, because perennials are more adapted, or maybe they're less adapted. They're more wild, and they're more, I don't know, they understand the changing of the seasons better, and they will produce less in these systems, perhaps. How do you feel about that?
I think the way the annuals were bred from their wild land races, I think that they were bred for high production, high use of nutrients in the soil, high water needs, high sun needs, and also in some cases, high need for pesticides and herbicides. They aren't bred to, be able to outcompete some of the challenges of agriculture. So they're expecting in their lifespan to be grown in an agricultural setting with lots of inputs. But the trade-off is that they're very productive, and they produce really, really well and reliably, given as long as their inputs are met. And then perennials, on the other hand, some of them produce on par and more than annual plants. But overall, I feel like there are some, especially in the early years, there are some yield sacrifices that you have to make while the plant gets established. But it's all about changing our mindset from like trying to maximize short-term gain to maximizing the long-term production of the system and the overall ecosystem health too, because it's not just for the only goal is not only producing high yield, it's also increasing carbon in the soil, organic matter, wildlife habitats, improving soil structure, that sort of thing. So I think there are trade-offs when working with perennial plants. I don't know, is that what you were asking?
Yeah, I'd say you hit it on the head. And maybe I'm distracting from this whole episode. The original idea that we have here is that it's fall, winter is coming. Something that I really invested in back in 2020 was a small greenhouse system. And at the time I was thinking about annual plants. I hadn't really totally delved into perennials yet in greenhouse systems. I looked to Elliot Coleman's The Four Season Harvest as a guide to sort of, set me on my way. I was, reading it over the summer, and then the fall, I really got things in place. And some of the specific varieties of vegetables that I could be cultivating in there, I recognized pretty early on it's mostly greens. For those of us who are in cold climates, having a supply of fresh greens all winter long is pretty invaluable. You could go and track the amount of money that you spend at your local whatever Stop and Shop or Safeway, and it adds up in terms of whatever greens you're purchasing. Think about the amount of miles that those greens had to travel to get to your local grocery store. They were not made anywhere near you if you're in Idaho or Connecticut or Missouri or wherever in the northern hemisphere during the wintertime. Unless you're in Texas, it's highly unlikely. Even in Texas, it's highly unlikely that those greens were harvested and transported to your local grocery store within a decent distance. So some of the plants that I was reading about at the time were arugulas, beets, specifically the greens. Who knew that you could, plant specific varieties of beets to eat just the greens of them or the microgreens? Also broccoli raabs, carrots, which are, they're not necessarily eaten for the greens, but carrots are something that are frequently implemented in these systems, and they don't necessarily compete with the other vegetables that are growing around them because they're sending down this big taproot and they're not taking up that much space above ground. Same thing with lots of chards like Swiss chard or chicories, which are a perennial. That's, for most people that chicory means dandelion. And you would think, oh, dandelion, why would I want to eat that? Well, in fact, lots of varieties of chicories have been improved over centuries and are very tasty. Endive, chicory, dandelion, they're pretty much all the same thing. Claytonia is another option. Collards, I could go on and on about collards. Maybe I'll talk about this at the end, but in terms of perennials, frequently collards and kales, when you put them into a covered system like this, they'll be perennial. They'll grow for 3 years or more and grow back from their roots. You would, so long as you don't pull things out of the ground, which you shouldn't be doing anyway, that you'll be surprised at what overwinters for more than 1 year or 2 years. And, it might blow you away, but it could be something as simple as a collard that overwinters in your greenhouse because they're perennial in zone 8. And something that Elliot Coleman recognized was that when he implemented his quote unquote double cover system, he could get an entire zone and a half farther south. It was like he was gardening in Maine and he had the climate of New Jersey because he used not only a greenhouse, but then used hoop houses within it, or sometimes just as simple as throwing just like a plastic cover over his greens at the ground level. He would achieve that incredible distance of climate change in a good way. So it's very unusual to hear that term used in a beneficial reference.
But yeah, that was a really interesting point you made too about how, sometimes things we think as annuals, like, collard greens or even like tomatoes and peppers, we think of them as annual plants, meaning the physiology of the plant is to live for 1 year and then die at the end of the year after its life cycle. But in some cases, these plants are actually, they live as annuals because they just can't take a hard freeze, or any freeze in the case of some of the tropical annuals. But yeah, tomatoes and peppers, these are perennial plants in other climates. And it's only because the winter comes or the late fall freeze comes. And that's why these plants don't live on. But if we're able to sort of control our climate a little bit and create these microclimates, I don't know necessarily that you'd be able to overwinter tomatoes passively in a greenhouse like that. I guess it's possible. But I guess the point I'm just underscoring your point that you can really open up the palette of species that you're working with if you're able to shift sometimes just, one zone or a zone and a half warmer, which could be, a matter of, 5 degrees, 10 degrees, and sometimes even less. Just a few degrees can really open up the plant palette that you have to work with.
Exactly. And when it comes to what you were saying about tomatoes, I would argue that the only thing there is that when we think about tomatoes, like the big slicers, like Cherokee Purple or Big Boy, Better Boy, those ones really have been like annualized to a nth degree. I don't know if, you could really get away with growing those perennially. I feel like they just like peter out. The tomato came from just like a small cherry tomato that people eventually just bred it over and over to create these massive, delicious Cherokee Purple tomatoes. So
yeah, I think it depends on if they're determinate or indeterminate, perhaps, like if they produce and flower all at once and then they're sort of done, or if they continue to produce. But you're right, it might come down to cultivar, and if the cultivars haven't been bred for living for a very long time, they might, even though technically they could live on, they might become very susceptible to certain diseases or pathogens, which, practically make them annuals. Although just physiologically, there's not any reason why they'd have to die after a year.
One reason that we should talk about kales here more than tomatoes, perhaps, is that although what we've been talking about might work with tomatoes and peppers in certain climates or in certain greenhouses, especially heated greenhouses, you're definitely not going to be able to grow tomatoes for production over the winter in the north in a passive or unheated greenhouse system. The idea of the 4-season harvest is that you're growing something during the fall and the summer, and you're succession sowing, so you're sowing seed throughout the growing season. You're not trying to necessarily grow something in the middle of the winter, you're just harvesting it during the winter. And so as the daylight hours go down and we move closer to the winter solstice, the ability to grow tomatoes in a covered system really just, I don't think is really that possible. When we're talking about tomatoes and the sort of pushing the zone, that's sort of hypothetical, but people have really actually practiced using cold hardy annuals and cold hardy perennials like brassicas, which are collards, kales, etc., or cold hardy greens. Anything that has winter in the title of it generally works very well for this situation. Those crops, lots of Asian greens also, all of those crops can be harvested all winter long if they're planted at a certain time during the growing season. Maybe it's June, maybe it's July, maybe it's as late as September. And so long as you succession sow, you can harvest all winter long. If you plant tomatoes or peppers from seed in September or June, it's not going to work the same. Maybe it'll work the same if you're somewhere down south, but in the north, where I live, it's really limited to mostly cold hardy annuals or perennials. Perennials generally that produce a cut and come again harvest of greens. So that's why we're talking about kales. I personally have some history with kales and overwintering them. So keeping that in mind, just about the idea of what an annual is, in your zone, let's say you're in zone 6, which is where Ben and I are. If you're cultivating things like collards or kales outdoors, like lacinato kale or red Russian kale, all of these kales are, they're not necessarily annuals. They're just bred to be harvested as annuals in your climate. I had red Russian kale from a local seed source that overwintered just fine. Over a year later, it's still producing, and I just keep cutting it back. And it's acting as if it's a perennial. And that's just because of the way I've been treating it. I put one layer of protection over it for the winter, completely ignored it. I didn't water it. That's the thing, is that during the wintertime, you really don't have to water because of the difference in sun angles and also the difference in evaporation of the soil, et cetera, et cetera. I just let it be there. And I have red Russian kale in my garden that is doing fantastic, producing like crazy, going to seed. I cut it back, it grows back. It's essentially a perennial kale, but at the same time it's not, which is a weird thing to think about. It's not officially perennial. It really depends on a lot of different factors. Moving on into the other sort of plants that you could experiment with that Eliot Coleman really talked about in his book, as I already mentioned, things like dandelion, endive, escarole, garlic greens. You can grow garlic in your greenhouses, or really any sort of onion, and just harvest the greens as a perennial crop. and just, leave the underground parts there. You don't have to mess with them unless it's like incredibly wet in your greenhouse and the onions are gonna rot. Otherwise they'll be just fine, and you can just keep harvesting those greens from the onions or the garlic or whatever. Kale, I could go forever and ever and on into the different types of kales. Whether there are perennial kales out there that we've talked about before. Maybe I'll get back into that later. Other stuff: kohlrabi, leeks, lettuces, mosh. Mosh is a very interesting one, and I actually learned about mosh through that book, The Four Season Harvest. I highly recommend that our listeners get it. The Four Season Harvest by Eliot Coleman. Also, Minatina, also known as Herbacilla plantain. That's a perennial. Mizuna, mustard greens. Mustard greens frequently will naturalize in your landscape. They frequently will pop back up, go to seed, just become self-sowing annuals that you never have to worry about again. Other options for the winter greenhouse: pak choi, parsley, radicchio, or chicory, dandelion. These are all pretty much the same thing, just under different names. Chicorum intybus is the Latin name, and they're usually perennial, and they're usually delicious too. When it comes to something I'd like to experiment with more in my landscape, it would be selecting from some of the tastiest versions of cultivated dandelion. Basically, like, dandelion greens can be rather bitter when they're raw, but there's some that are pretty darn good. I've had a few. I mean, even if you go to fancy restaurants, they'll be in your salad and you don't even recognize that they're there, because they're just greens to you. But if you're picking them and harvesting them and doing whatever, you notice the difference. Other options: radish, scallions, sorrel, another perennial that you can use in these sort of systems, and it just extends your harvest window. Using perennials in covered systems really should be experimented with more. I feel like when it came to this book, Eliot Coleman was pretty stuck on annual crops, and part of that probably has to do with his own experiences and advertising to people who were used to annuals. But you could probably realistically replace all this stuff with perennial crops in a four-season situation. Other stuff: spinach, tatsoi. Tatsoi is actually a great one when it comes to the winter harvest. Or turnips and watercress. Turnips obviously are more of you're waiting for the spring. It takes a long time. And watercress, you need to have a really saturated system, but you could have watercress in a covered greenhouse where the soil is really saturated, and probably just harvest it all winter long if you're in like zone 7 perhaps, or zone 6B in a microclimate. Because depending on how you approach that system, and if you use raised beds or if you incorporate some sort of compost system to warm the interior, watercress will just keep producing and producing and producing and producing, and you could just have infinite amounts of it. I mean, it grows like a weed.
Cool. I'll talk a little bit about harvesting some of the tree products that you can get in the fall. It's very easy to find trees that produce their crop in the fall. The ones that produce in the spring or summer, you have your peaches and plums and mulberries and that sort of thing. But really, the prime time is from end of August, really the beginning of September, at least in my climate here in Missouri, to middle of October is really when everything's falling. And it's a good time to get out and both harvest from your own forest garden, but also if you don't have access to the trees, or your trees aren't producing yet, there's most likely lots of trees in your area. I'd like to think that you have access to community food forests where you are, but most people don't. Thankfully, there's a lot of trees that produce wild fruits and nuts in wild areas and forests and woodlands. But assuming you do have a forest garden, you're lucky enough to have a forest garden, early September to beginning of October is a great time for harvesting your walnuts and pecan, and also chestnuts as well. And the reason why I say it's a good time and not the only time is you could wait to harvest some of these things until later on into the fall if you're not as punctual. Depending on your area, you may have some other animals and birds and insects that are also interested in your fruit and nuts. And so you want to basically be on them as quick as you can. Unless you're living in a very urban environment where you sadly don't have a lot of animals that are going to come by and sweep up your pecans and pawpaws and that sort of thing. Unless you live in that sort of situation, yeah, you're gonna want to be out there checking fairly often. I suppose some people might do some sort of netting or protection before harvest to ensure that they're actually getting, what they've been growing all year and that the squirrels or deer don't run off with it. I think it's probably a better idea to just be out there watching when you can. Hopefully you live near the property or on the property that you're harvesting from, so you can keep an eye on when they start to drop. Now, I think I'll probably focus on walnuts, pecans, chestnuts, pawpaw, and persimmon. And out of those, just thinking through here, you kind of have to, I'm thinking if there's any ones you could pull off early. And I think persimmons are probably the only ones that you can harvest early. Pretty much everything else, you're going to want to wait till it either falls off the tree or, you could shake them off. I mean, you don't have to wait till they fall off of their own volition. You could shake off your walnuts, your pecans, your pawpaws, and your persimmons. But unfortunately, oftentimes what happens is for persimmons, if you wait till they're totally ripe and fall off the tree, they're usually hit the ground and splat, and then there's nothing left. And also to a lesser degree, pawpaws, though, sometimes you can find them on the ground fully intact. But as far as black walnut goes, you want to make sure that before you harvest anything or try to shake off the tree, you want to make sure that the green fruit around the nut gives to pressure. So you're going to press in with your thumb and it should feel like a ripe pear. That's usually what we go by. And then as soon as you get that sort of soft fruit, because throughout the whole year, that fruit's going to be rock hard. But then if you can press in and it feels like a soft pear, then that's probably a good time to pick or a good time to shake it off the tree. On Facebook, there was someone who posted, a big harvest of black walnuts in like July, and they posted it in a basket and like, I just harvested all these walnuts. What do you guys think I should do? And unfortunately, everyone was like, sorry, you should have waited a couple extra months because you're not going to have too much use for those right now, which isn't totally true. You can use green walnuts earlier in the summer for nocino, which is a liqueur. You can use it for dye making. There's other uses, but for the most part, you want to harvest them in the beginning of September to mid-September when they start getting soft. And then just real quick on post-processing of walnuts, because it's something that I'm more familiar with. You're going to want to hull them, which you can either do manually. There's lots of interesting videos of people doing it online in clever ways because most people don't have a hulling machine. So you want to do that as soon as possible because you don't want any of the flavors from the fruit getting into the nut meat itself. You want to hull the outside fruit off as soon as possible. And then if you want the nuts to be really clean, you can pressure wash or hand scrub the nuts to get off all the little bits and pieces of the fruit. But if you don't really care so much, you can let those little pieces kind of just dry, and which is the next step. You want to dry the nuts for at least 3 weeks. I put them in a mesh bag and have a fan blowing on them for a while before throwing them into storage, which they store best in cooler temperatures. If you have a basement, cooler is typically better, and drier, of course, is better. As far as harvesting pecan, a lot of the same principles apply, but thankfully with pecan, at least the varieties I'm familiar with, the nut will actually fall free from the hull itself. So you won't have to, if you find any pecans that are like clinging to the hull's clinging to the nut, it's very likely that nut's not actually good. And that's almost like what they call an aborted fruit because the hull didn't open up because the nut's no good on the inside. So you don't even need to like pick those up off the ground. You can just leave those. But yeah, sometimes the nuts will fall completely free of the hull and you can just pick them off the ground, but you're still going to want to let them cure. You're going to want to let them dry for a few weeks before storing them or even before, if you want to eat them, before cracking them, it's still a good idea to let them dry because you want the nut kernel to sort of shrink down a little bit so that it will come free from the nutshell. Because if you think about it, if you remember cracking into Christmas nut baskets, when you get a nut open, sometimes it's hard to dig out the kernel from the shell. So the way to maximize the retrieval of those kernels is to make sure that it's nice and dry so that it'll pop out, because that way the kernel will be smaller and more concentrated in flavor. So it'll taste better. And then let's see, we'll go to chestnuts next. If you've never harvested chestnuts, it can be a dangerous job. They're covered in these, the burr is covered in these, razor sharp needles. Thankfully, there are some cultivars that, like pecan, will drop the chestnut free from the burr. So you can just pick them up off the ground. For all this, any of these nuts, you can use something called a nut wizard, which is essentially looks kind of like a rake. You got a handle, but at the business end of it, instead of a rake, it's it's hard to describe it. It's like a wire a little wire cage that's round, and you can roll the whole thing across the ground, and the nuts will pop into the wire cage, but then they can't come out. So it's a good way to gather up a lot of nuts quickly. So you can totally use those in the chestnuts. In some cases, you will have to like get in there and like pull the nuts out. So you're going to want to have really nice gloves so that you don't get stuck by these really sharp burrs. Chestnuts are one that, at least at the research farm at the university that I work in, they're sort of in the fall, they're the first things to get hit by the deer and the squirrels and chipmunks, that sort of thing. It's because they're easy to get into. You know, they have a shell, but it's a fairly thin shell, and they're very calorie dense too. They're water rich. So they're a very tasty thing to eat, even just raw. So that's usually what the animals will go to first. So you're going to want to be on those really fast and get them up off the ground and into storage. But then, of course, they also are the first to go as far as to rot. So they're very easy to go bad, unlike some of the other nuts that we talked about, which have a lower water content. Chestnuts have a fairly high water content, low fat, high carbohydrate, so they can decay very quickly. So you want to make sure that first thing you could do is just float all of your chestnuts in some water, on a big tub of water, and the bad nuts will float to the surface and the good nuts will sink to the bottom. So you can scrape off all the bad nuts so you're not pulling in diseased nuts into your storage container, which is not good. Then, of course, after you pour the water off, you want to make sure that you dry the nuts thoroughly. They don't have to be dried in the same way with like a fan and 3 weeks of drying like the walnuts that I recommended. They can be just dried to the touch, so that the water that you use for soaking is no longer there. And then you could seal them in plastic bags or a plastic container that's relatively airtight, and they'll keep for a while. As far as for eating, you'd want to keep them, for about a month, maybe 2 tops, but you're gonna probably want to freeze them to extend the shelf life. And I like to cook them. We'll have another episode, I think, on like recipes and how we prepare these foods in our cooking. So I'll hold off on going into that. But freezing is a good way to store your chestnuts after you've cooked them. And I suppose you could do it even before, but it saves some steps if you cook beforehand. If you want to plant them if you're doing this to stratify, all these seeds need to be stratified and exposed to a period of cold if you want them to germinate and grow into a tree the following year. So you can keep the chestnuts just in those plastic bags, maybe with some cocoa coir, just slightly damp, and they'll actually germinate in the bag. I had one that I just planted out midsummer that I forgot about in the back of my refrigerator, and that was still sprouting in the bag. So they can take their time sprouting, but you can usually get them to come up after a couple months of stratification. I guess I'll talk a little bit more about pawpaw harvesting. This goes for whether you are working with named varieties or wild fruit that you find. Pawpaws are a fruit that you're going to need to harvest as ripe as possible. Like I was saying, timing is key, and you don't want to be harvesting them too early because they tend not to ripen up. Although there's some wiggle room, I think they will get a little bit softer from when you pick them off the tree. If you keep them in a brown paper bag in a warm spot, they will ripen a little bit. But if you pick them, a week before they're ready, or two weeks before they're ready, or longer, the sugars won't develop. And you really want to make sure that the pawpaws that you're eating are ripe, because there's a lot of toxic parts to the plant, like the seeds and the leaves and the bark. And I believe the unripe fruit I believe they might have some of that annonacin, I think is the name of it, that you don't want to be consuming. So you want to make sure your pawpaws are nice and ripe and soft to the touch. But like I said, if it comes down to it, if they're slightly under, you can get away with it, because fortunately they're another fruit that the animals really love to go after: raccoons and deer. And if you have any squirrels in the area, that everything loves pawpaw. So you're going to want to be on those really quick. So if you wait till they fall to the ground, they might be gone the next morning by the time you get there. So you have to be careful. And then harvesting persimmons, like I talked about before, you're going to want to do those a decent amount before they're fully ripe, because you want them when they're mature, meaning that they've finished the growing cycle and they're fully formed, which might be in October, maybe late September. But if you wait until they're too soft to harvest, then it's just a disaster trying to get them in a container, pick them from the tree, pick them from the ground, because they're going to be so soft that they're just going to turn to mush. So it's probably better to harvest them while they're still a little firm, so that you can actually work with them, ripen them up in the way that you want to.
Everything that you talked about, I think, in regards to persimmons, I assume that has to do more with Asian persimmons. I've heard different things in regards to American persimmons. With the American persimmons that I've seen in Connecticut and New England, it's really more of a harvesting window closer to, I don't know, like November. And let's say if you decide to keep Asian persimmons on the tree, depending on the variety, the food forest at UMass, for example, where they have Nikita's Gift, they ripen super late in the season, and it's a pretty small tree, more of a shrub size, but it has plenty of fruit on it. And in terms of harvesting it, you don't need to harvest them early. So take that with a grain of salt in terms of how you decide to harvest your fruit. It's really on a case-by-case basis. It has to do with cultivar and how large your tree is. You could also, if it's a smaller tree, you can net it so that the persimmons, when they drop and when they're ripe, they don't drop and splat on the ground. They'll fall into like your netting and just hang there, and it'll be easier for you to notice. Also give it some protection from the critters around. So that's something to keep in mind, I guess. For harvesting pawpaws in mid-October, that is probably, in Connecticut when most pawpaw varieties would be ripening. I'm not sure if that's the same in your area or not.
Yeah, about the same.
And there are some people who, have early ripening pawpaws that go off in August, but for the most part, I'd say that right about now is pawpaw harvesting territory. Something else that I thought of, when it comes to really the majority of the fruit trees that you have, but specifically, let's use pawpaw as an example, there are quite a few different factors that sort of work together to determine when your pawpaws will be ripening. A good example of this, where I am in central Connecticut, nearby at Wesleyan, which is a college in Middletown, Connecticut, they have a food forest that is decently old. I think it was planted in like 2011 or maybe 2009. And they have several pawpaw trees there. I think they're seedlings. They might be a named cultivar. I'm not very sure. But because of where it is in Middletown, where you have the microclimate of the Connecticut River, and it's kind of an urban area, the food forest itself is surrounded by buildings, it's a pretty ideal zone to have a fruit tree that needs a certain amount of heat units to ripen its fruit. So having a pawpaw planted there, no matter what variety or seedling it is, because there are cultivated varieties that ripen earlier than others, that spot will ripen pawpaws in like early September to mid-September, and by the end of September, there's really not that many pawpaws left. They're like rotting on the ground. If you go 40 miles to the west, or even less, like let's say 20 miles in any direction away from the Connecticut River, I guess east or west, into an upland area, so we're talking about elevation now. Elevation will also affect ripening windows. If there are several trees at Cricket Hill Garden, which is a very, very cool nursery in western Connecticut. It might be in Zone 6A, it might be Zone 6B, but just the fact that it's in an upland area, the ripening window for the pawpaws there are almost a whole month later. And then I know of a different person in Connecticut down by the shoreline who also has seedling trees, and the pawpaws there ripen even more like late August into September. So all these different factors like location, microclimate, heat units, elevation, proximity to reflective heat surfaces or water bodies that provide microclimate, the extent of the hardiness range of a species. So let's say that you're cultivating pawpaws in Ontario. It's possible that your pawpaws are ripening in late October, maybe early November, depending on all of the factors that we talked about. And that might not be good because you don't want a frost to come in, but I don't know, if there's anyone listening who right now who's cultivating pawpaws in Ontario, we'd love to hear from you. So if you're pushing the range of the fruit that you're trying to ripen, or if you're taking advantage of microclimates, all of this stuff factors into when you'll be harvesting these crops during the fall. If it's October, September, November, you can kind of play around with different scenarios to extend your harvest window. You can plant one tree in an area that, is right next to a large stone or pavement or brick surface that is going to reflect a lot of heat and give your tree the heat units to ripen fruit quickly or more soon in the season. And then you can also plant a tree that's maybe in more of like a frost pocket area or an area that doesn't have heat reflective surfaces around it, and the trees will ripen at slightly different times, and you'll just, that's ideal. You don't want all of your fruit to ripen all at once in the same week. That's the worst case scenario. You want to extend your season as much as possible. This is true of lots of different types of fruits, but pawpaw is just a good example here. So it's mid-October, it's pawpaw harvesting time. Another thing to think about is American persimmons. They taste better after a frost. It really sweetens them. There's a number of vegetables, I'm thinking of carrots, that taste better after a frost. Going into sort of the idea of harvests and storage, some plants like carrots or turnips can really be left in the ground past the frost state in your area and harvested later on. And as I said, they become sweeter after a frost. One great example of this, specific to my region, which is New England, and even more specific, Connecticut, is the Ruth Stout method. Ruth Stout was this really old woman who wrote a book a while ago where she would harvest turnips and onions and root vegetables from underneath basically like hay bales that would sit there all winter long. She was based in Reading, Connecticut, which at the time was probably like zone 5, borderline zone 6. These days is more like zone 7. And she just, I really don't know how she did it. She must have had like no vol pressure, no slugs, just got away with all these things that people who've been trying to replicate what she did are just like, how did she do this? But essentially, she just had this winter harvest method of leaving things where they were, having an abundance of crops. I guess if she had a vole that would eat something, she'd keep track of it, potentially kill it, or trap it, poison it, who knows, and would then just continue harvesting until the spring. And her claim to fame was the fact that she used the deep mulch method. She didn't weed. The only thing she would do is bend over and harvest her crops throughout all times of year. So when it comes to this, idea of the winter harvest, it doesn't just have to be inside of a covered system like a greenhouse or a cold frame or what have you. It can just be in your backyard, and maybe it's worth experimenting with some of the Ruth Stout method ideas of like using a hay bale as something that will keep your turnips protected and insulated throughout the winter. Snow itself is a great insulator, so there's sometimes where your root vegetables, if there's 3 feet of snow on top of them, it's better than just having them exposed to winter wind and freezing rain, etc., etc. Earlier, I talked about all these winter greens that you could be growing in a covered system. Something that I forgot to mention, or it's kind of important to think about, is that when you're harvesting the winter greens in these covered systems, you have to do it during a certain window, which is generally the warmest time of the day. So you're not going to be waking up at 6 in the morning and harvesting these greens before you go to work. You really want to harvest them, around like 1 or 2 in the afternoon, which is when the sun has already taken all the frost off of your spinach or your Swiss chard or whatever that's in these double covered or single cover systems. And just to clarify, when I say double cover system, what I mean is Eliot Coleman's idea of having a greenhouse or high tunnel with a secondary system within it. So having one large hoop house or greenhouse, and inside of that having a smaller little mini greenhouse that is also covered. So like we talked about before, what that does is it adds an extra layer of protection and moves you farther south in terms of climate and microclimate. So back to this idea of harvest windows and why you should be harvesting in the afternoon. Because if you don't do that, if you harvest them early in the morning, you can potentially harm the plant. It will not respond well to being harvested while it's frozen. The ground can freeze overnight and the plants will be okay, so long as the soil warms up throughout the day. And that middle of the day period when it's full sun and everything inside of the greenhouse looks really happy is the time for you to harvest the plant. It's also kind of important to think that if you're going to harvest the plant really, really, really heavily, it's probably not going to survive for the entire winter. It's better to pick and choose here and there and to harvest from the outside of the plant, the lower stems, the lower stalks, what have you, so that it continues to grow upright and creates a longer harvest overall. If you were to, for example, something like celery, when you get celery at the grocery store, it's just this big clump. You don't have to harvest it as a big clump. You can pick away at it at the outer edges. That's, like how cutting celery or other sorts of celery relatives that don't create big stalks, they create mostly leafy material. That's how those are traditionally harvested. So you just kind of have to think about that in terms of elongating your harvest windows. In terms of other winter harvest ideas, winter squash and other sorts of squash are really fantastic. One of my favorites, butternut. We had a winter squash that was just covered with a dish towel that was preserved for almost a whole year. It was a butternut that we planted stupidly in the spring rather than in midsummer. Reason being that if you plant butternut squash in midsummer, you can have a fall harvest. And we, we harvested it in the middle of summer. We didn't eat it. It sat on the counter forever. When it was exposed to just the natural light in the room, it appeared to sort of slowly transform and change color. And then we just decided to cover it with a dish towel, blocking off all the light. It wasn't in any sort of real protected area. It wasn't in a basement or a cool, dry place. It was just the area that most people are interacting in all the time, the kitchen. And something as simple as just covering it with a towel basically preserved it for a ridiculous amount of time. And we made butternut squash soup, and it was amazing. It's one of my favorite meals. I imagine that's the same for you.
Yeah, I love it. I don't make it as much as I should, but I feel like during the wintertime, a lot of gardeners have butternut squash hanging around their house just because the plant produces a lot and it's hard to use it up very quickly. And it stores for a long time, like you said. So I think it's a common thing that people have left over from the harvest season. That's my go-to, making butternut squash soup, as opposed to, I think you could roast it like any other squash, but usually, people make pretty rich soups with creams and really nice, like caramelized onions all blended up, and spices. And so it can be really delicious. So that's probably the main thing that I do with my butternut squash.
Yeah, and it took me a while to realize that adding in a carrot makes it extra sweet. Or like a carrot that has undergone the frost period. Oof. Oh God, my mouth is watering. But before I pass it over back to you, I just wanted to say that when it comes to these winter vegetables, let's say you have an abundance of them, and let's say that there's so much butternut squash or other winter squash, acorn, what have you, that there really isn't enough room in your kitchen or wherever. It's not just one squash sitting on the countertop. You have an abundance that you have to store somewhere. If you have a basement that is unfinished, or a garage, or an area that has basically a dirt floor or a cement floor, something without a carpet, whatever, and it's just an area that is somewhat unheated, or maybe it gets some radiant heat from a different area of the house, maybe it gets some radiant heat from the above areas, like it's in your basement, it's unfinished, and your boiler's down there, whatever. This is a fantastic place for you to essentially create your own little sectioned off root cellar, where through some basically DIY hacks, you can create a little plywood zone that could be as small as like 4 by 4 feet, even probably more ideally like 8 by 8 feet. where in this area you can store a ridiculous amount of food in a rack system in a very small footprint of space in your house. And you can use something as simple as like insulation and just tubing to exchange air throughout that area. Someone to check out would be Sean Dembrowski, also known as Edible Acres on YouTube. He has that set up in his basement, I believe. It's a good example of this system I'm describing. I've encountered one other person who has this set up in their basement area, but they kind of neglected it. One thing I will say is that you really do have to kind of be on top of the storage of these squash or potatoes or whatever. It could be, like Ben mentioned, like nuts. It could be chestnuts. It could be black walnuts. The chestnuts and black walnuts will store a lot longer than some of the other things that we've talked about. You really kind of have to check on a weekly, if not daily or every other day basis to make sure that your food is storing properly and not rotting, or that there's not some mold that is growing on XYZ thing. Because at the end of the day, it's not a refrigerator. It would probably be better to process all these foods, ideally in an ideal situation, to process them all and then freeze them and then just be able, or can them or whatever. But in terms of having a root cellar, it is doable. It just requires a decent amount of checking up on. If you already have a routine of feeding your fish and walking your dog, well, just integrate that into the routine. Like, you're going to walk your dog and then you're going to go downstairs and see that your butternut squash are still doing okay. And in that way, you could potentially have butternut squash that lasts you years, longer than just one season. Like, these things will last a while and stay good for a long time.
Yeah, I know Ben Falk has a really interesting technique for storing vegetables. I mean, he's got interesting techniques for pretty much doing everything in this space, but one that stuck with me was, he's got a root cellar, and so he'll have his, cabbages and root vegetables down there. They're stored throughout the fall and into the winter. And then as he starts to notice that some of them might be starting to go bad, not necessarily rot, but when they start to maybe dehydrate, or the texture starts to change, and you can tell that things are starting to go south if you don't do anything. What he'll do is he'll actually just take those vegetables, shred them up, and turn them into sauerkraut or some other form of fermented vegetable. And then now he's got an additional, how long will sauerkraut last? Like 6 months or a year, or however long it does. And so he can extend the life of those vegetables that would otherwise just have rotted in his cellar. So there's all sorts of creative ways to reuse things right as they start to get to the end of their lifespan in storage.
I do love me a good sauerkraut.
Oh yeah, me too.
I feel like we quote people like Sean and Ben Falk too often on this podcast without
maybe not often enough.
Or maybe not often enough. They are some very ingenuitive people.
Yeah.
But anyways, yeah, so that's pretty much all I had to say about the winter squash and the idea of harvesting and then keeping your harvest for such a long period of time. Some other things I wanted to maybe talk about were like plant propagation or overwintering of certain things like peppers, taking stuff out of the ground, bringing it inside. I'm mostly going to defer to you. I feel like you have some things to talk about in this regard.
Sure. Well, so I was thinking about it, and really, for talking about fall activities, even though there are ways to take autumn cuttings of certain plants, they're relatively few compared to the plants that do best with spring cuttings, at least in my experience. And so I feel like when it comes to plant propagation, you're sort of limited to division of your perennials, and then also seed collecting, like for your, not just trees, but your herbaceous plants too. If you're someone I like to collect seeds from the plants that I grow and save them. We've talked in this podcast in the past about the difference between asexual and sexual reproduction, the latter being in the form of seeds, and there's pros and cons to choosing to propagate your plants using those methods. And so I forget, Mike, was that another fall episode we discussed the plant propagation, or do we do a whole separate episode on the plant prop stuff?
We did an entire episode on propagation methods for the backyard food forest.
That's right.
And that will be released on November 12th. So for those listening, you have not heard it yet.
Okay, so we'll definitely go into the detail about the different techniques, but in terms of the fall, yeah, I mean I think propagation should mainly be limited to seeds to seed collecting and divisions of your bunching vegetables like your clumping onions, Jerusalem artichokes, that sort of thing.
Wait, why don't we talk about sunchokes? Because that's a great, right now it's October. Sunchokes, this is the time to be harvesting sunchokes. Somewhat recently, I was rereading Will Bonsel's Essential Guide to Radical Self-Reliant Gardening, Innovative Techniques for Growing Vegetables, Grains, and Perennial Food Crops. And in that, he has quite a bit on sunchokes and their resilience as a perennial food crop that you can harvest heavy every single fall and just keep taking a bounty from, leaving only a few tubers in the ground. But he really advocates for harvesting your sunchokes every single season, basically to refresh them. So sunchokes are a great example of something that should be harvested right now and could potentially be stored throughout the winter. But you might want to harvest them and eat them right away. It depends on how many sunchokes you are growing, and I imagine that our listeners might have never heard of a sunchoke before or have just a small amount of them planted. If that's the case, they're essentially like a perennial potato, but are really a sunflower relative. They create a tuber underground that you can eat. They are delicious, but also have an amount of inulin in them. So some people have nicknamed them fart chokes because they make you fart. Well, that's only true if you eat a lot of them. So in that regard, they are really good to have as sort of like a side to your main meal. And in Will Bonsel's Guide to Radical Self-Reliance, he describes basically that the best way to manage them is to harvest every single year because they will divide and multiply from a single division of the tuber. So imagine you're holding a potato and you chop it up into 10 different parts. If there's an eye on that part, which is basically the spot where a little sprout will shoot out from if you let your potato sit there forever, it's the same thing for a sunchoke. And let's say a vole or a groundhog comes in and decimates your entire sunchoke plot. It doesn't matter. The sunchokes will come back next year. And this is why we generally recommend that you don't plant sunchokes in a place that are not going to be dedicated to sunchokes forever. But in terms of it being October, winter is approaching. Now's the time to get some sunchokes out of the ground and to sample some. Maybe try one or two pieces raw. Try them roasted, grill them. See how it goes. Maybe try them as a potato substitute. Mash them, do whatever. Put them in a stew. I don't know. And try storing some. And try storing them the same way that you would store a potato.
Yeah, that's. I'm glad you kind of gave a little highlight profile on sunchokes. They're definitely a good plant exactly for this time of year. Some people also enjoy them in the spring too, but they're one of those plants that's nice to have around throughout the fall, even into the winter. Fills out the season kind of nicely. Thinking about other things that happen in the forest garden, when it comes to pruning, I usually like to wait until actual winter times. Maybe we'll save that for a more winter themed episode. If you do it too early, the plant might not be totally dormant yet, and the best time to do your pruning is when the plant is totally dormant. Winter is also a great time to take scion wood. So we'll probably wait for a later episode to really go into depth about managing your trees in the forest garden. It's the perfect time. Fall really is about what we've covered here, which is the harvesting, the storage, consuming too of all these wonderful fruits, nuts, and vegetables that grow in the forest garden. So I don't know. Do you do any particular propagation in the fall, Mike?
I was just going to say that we've probably pretty much come to the end of the episode. We've covered so very much. The one last thing that I want to say in regards to transplanting or in regards to propagation is that when it comes to pawpaw trees, apparently, if you get a bare root pawpaw tree after the frost, the chances of it surviving in ground and popping up and shooting out new growth the next year are considerably less than if you were to acquire one now in the fall and it still has some leaves on it. It's about ready to go into dormancy, but it hasn't yet. Now's the time to be transplanting young pawpaw bare root plants. I did this back in, let's see, like 2020, right? And I did everything. I planted things from seed that I could get. I planted things from bare root that I got in September and then October and November. And even as late as December, and big surprise, everything that I got after the frost did nothing. And I was just not very well informed. People don't tell you. There's not a whole lot of information out there about pawpaw transplanting, period. You kind of have to really do your research. So yeah, so if you're interested in growing pawpaws, they're one sort of outlier that they are better transplanted now when they still have some green leaves on them, rather than transplanting them after the frost, which is what you would do in most cases. Another general thing is that, like, it's October, there's probably ridiculous deals on trees and perennials at your local Lowe's or wherever. And if those plants, we've talked about this in previous episodes, or at least I have, but if those plants have a healthy root system, that's that's a plant worth buying. You can go and buy an apple tree now, put it in the ground for a fraction of the price of buying it in the spring several months ago, and it'll probably do just fine.
Yeah, are there any specific tips or tricks that you think about when it comes to planting trees in the fall?
Yeah, I mean, the whole reason why you're planting it now is that you don't have to irrigate it. If you plant, let's say that you go to your local Home Depot and you buy a peach tree, it's been sitting there for the entirety of the summer and now the fall, and it's like $10 when it would have been $100 months ago. You buy it, check it out, look at the roots. If it's root bound and the roots are wrapping around the tree, you really want to kind of separate those roots and take them out of the wrapping circular form so it doesn't strangle the tree later on. It's, in some cases, people actually even recommend like cutting away those roots entirely. I personally haven't done that. I've just kind of ripped away at them and really messed up the roots to get them in a situation where they're no longer in a circular formation as much as I can. This is the reason why you buy bare root trees in the first place, or trees in air prune pots, because that sort of root formation doesn't happen in those situations usually. But yeah, in terms of tips and tricks, I mean, you can just stick that plant in the ground after messing with the roots a little bit, and then hopefully it's going to be a pretty wet fall and winter, depending on where you are. I'm in the Northeast, where that is pretty common. And then you don't have to worry about irrigating the tree, where if you plant it in the spring, it's highly recommended that usually you have a pretty good irrigation setup, depending on how early you plant it or whatever. But in terms of tips and tricks, my tips and tricks are: buy it cheap in the fall, plant it in the ground, put it in a place where it has access to water, but it's not going to be inundated. It has a good free draining soil, a pretty maybe like within reach of the water table, but not right on it. And just forget about it and let nature do its course, and you'll be very happily, pleasantly surprised with the results.
Yeah, I feel like this is a good way to sort of bring the episode to a close, is talking about tree planting, just because that's a great activity to do in the fall, to just expand the amount of species that you have that you're working with. And like you said, yeah, I think it's less of a shock to plant in the fall, because the plant will likely still have some activity going on in the roots, and will be able to establish itself a little bit at the end of the fall. And then as soon as the ground warms up in the spring, it will start exploring and expanding its root system, as opposed to planting right in the middle of the spring. It's like not giving the tree the best shot that it has. So my thing this year when it comes to tree planting and transplanting too, is making sure that the soil that I fill back in, whether it's a hole in the ground or whether it's in a container, is very compact. And that doesn't necessarily mean if you're using really heavy, if there's really heavy clay, it doesn't necessarily mean like making it so compact that it's rock hard at the surface. But for most people who don't have just pure clay soil, you're going to want to not only give that that newly planted tree a lot of water, you're going to want to make sure that the soil is very well settled, because any air pockets or gaps in the soil structure is going to expose the roots to air, and air will kill roots. Air is really bad for tree roots, or any roots of any plant for the most part, that you're, at least the ones that you're trying to grow in your garden. And so I really try to make sure that I'm packing in the soil, so that, when you want, of course, the rule of thumb is to make sure that the tree is planted to the soil line of the pot that it came from. You don't want to have like the bark, covered up with soil, or planted so high up in the soil that the roots are exposed. You want to make sure it's nice and even to where it was when it came in the pot, or you can kind of tell where the root crown is if the tree came bare root. But that being said, you want to make sure that your soil is tamped down properly, because sometimes the tree could look like it's perfectly level and planted at the right height, but as soon as you press the soil in with your foot or your hand, everything just sinks down, 3 inches. And so, okay, now you're planting in a depressed area that's going to fill up with, A, may have a lot of air pockets, and B, if it's a deep dish that the tree is being planted in, it's going to collect a lot of water, which, in certain climates, that's a good thing. But most of the humid temperate areas, you really don't want to have water just collecting around the base of the tree for an extended period of time, because that's how you get root rot. So I like to make sure that the levels, the tree, the root collar is kind of in ground or in line with the soil, maybe even raised up. Planting in a slight mound is actually preferable if you ask most tree planters. And then also that the soil around the tree is very tightly tamped in, and then just soaking it, just giving it more water than you think you need, to make sure that you reduce the amount of shock that the tree is exposed to when you plant it in the ground. Those are my tree planting tips.
Fantastic tips. I was thinking just now, like maybe this should have been an entirely different episode. It's like fall tree planting, whatever. To everybody who's been listening, these are our fall recommendations and suggestions. We'd love to hear from you if you have any responses or any suggestions of your own that we might have missed. And once again, just to reiterate, winter is different for everyone, depending on what hemisphere you're in, depending on what USDA climate zone you're in, depending on what country you're in. It's been very cool to hear from some of our listeners who are in Japan and Portugal and wherever. It's been, it's wild. I only ever thought that people would be listening from the United States. So we are only really capable of talking about our own experiences on this podcast, which are very much in a 4-season cold climate temperate system. That doesn't mean that we wouldn't love to hear from you. So please write into us. You can send us an email to theforestgardenpodcast@gmail.com, or you can send us a direct message on our Instagram account, Forest Garden Podcast, which is, Forest Garden Podcast on Instagram. We just really like to hear any sort of feedback that you have, anything you'd like to say, even if you're going to say, hey, you guys suck. I mean, we want to know why. So reach out. We'd love to hear from you.
All right.
Maybe don't say you guys suck. No, but do you have anything that you want to finish it off with, or are we good?
No, I thought that was a good closing that you just did.
All right. Yeah. All right. Well, everybody, thank you for listening, and tune in for our following episodes. We have many more to come.